Hey everyone, David Chen here. Spider-Man No Way Home. It's finally out in theaters. Let's talk about it. Now, I want to say, I know a lot of people are trying to avoid spoilers for this movie. You should assume this video has full spoilers on the whole film. So if you don't want to be spoiled in the movie, if you don't want to know anything about the plot, skip this video. I'm going to spoil literally everything all the way to the end of the movie. So do not watch this video, bookmark it, come back, and let's begin. Spider-Man No Way Home finds Peter Parker and his friends dealing with the aftermath of the events of Spider-Man Far From Home, in which Peter Parker was framed for a series of drone attacks and his secret identity was revealed to the world. Kid's having a rough week. Peter Parker works with Dr. Strange to cast a spell that will fix things, but when the spell goes awry, people from Spider-Man's past start appearing in the present, and not just this Spider-Man's past, but also previous editions of Spider-Man, specifically the Spider-Man from the Sam Raimi and Mark Webb films. I want to start by saying I love this movie. I had so much fun in the theater watching this movie. I had a big dumb grin on my face the entire time because it's just a pure geek fantasy to not only see like a movie like Avengers where you have characters from other films cross over and combine into one big one, but in this movie we're seeing characters from past versions of this character on the big screen come back here. We're seeing villains from those films come back. It is a piece of corporate IP crossover that I feel is one of the most ambitious things I've ever seen. As a piece of just film production, not even direction, just like film production, which I'm talking about like getting the legal rights to all these characters and all these actors and their likenesses and making sure the actors' schedules lined up and selling the idea to everyone. It is a huge accomplishment, and I just want to acknowledge that up top. But looking at the movie itself, I think this movie actually does have a pretty cool arc for Peter Parker. In this movie, Peter Parker continues to grapple with the challenges that come with being Spider-Man, balancing his life and the things that he loves and the friends that he loves, along with trying to be a crime-fighting Spider-Man. And at the end of the movie, he needs to make the ultimate sacrifice. All of his friends get eternal sunshine, and he needs to decide whether he's going to be a part of their lives again. And he decides not to. And it is actually really heartbreaking. You know, we get to see him move into his own apartment, and we basically get to see the Spider-Boy become a Spider-Man. My friend Dan Gvozden at the Amazing Spider Talk has talked about this movie, Spider-Man No Way Home, as completing the origin story of this version of Peter Parker, which is weird to think about because, you know, we all thought they skipped over the origin story for this version of Peter Parker. But it really does feel like at the end of this movie, this is the Spider-Man that everyone thinks of when they think of Spider-Man, the one that's out there solving crimes, fighting crime, and trying not to let his Spider-Man persona destroy the rest of his life. Who knows where they're going to take Spider-Man from this point forward, but this movie does open up a lot of possibilities for the character. From this point forward, they can introduce whole new characters, villains, trends, whatever they want to do, and it's going to be okay within the plotline and the construct of this film. So pretty creative from a storytelling perspective. I also want to point out that the tie-ins to the rest of the Marvel universe in this movie are pretty minimal. You got Doctor Strange showing up in this movie, but everything else in terms of Marvel stuff is pretty minimal. There's way more tie-ins to the rest of the Sony universe in this movie. And so let's get to it. Let's talk about the main event, the multiverse.
Multiverse is a concept about which we know frighteningly little.
Spider-Man No Way Home brings back villains from Spider-Man's and films past, but the much bigger deal, in my opinion, is it brings back the other actors who have played Spider-Man, specifically Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield. Now, if it had just brought all these people back for glorified cameos, that would have been fun, but could have easily been very forgettable. What is so special about what this movie does and the way it brings these characters back is it tries to interrogate the idea of Spider-Man and how it's played out on the big screen in the past, and also the ways in which those movies have succeeded and failed. Spider-Man is a beloved character by millions of people, including myself, but the Spider-Man live-action films have had some rocky times. I was a huge fan of Spider-Man 1 and 2. I mean, when Spider-Man 1 came out, the Sam Raimi movie in 2002, it was kind of a revelation in terms of how you could portray a superhero character on the big screen. We'd had superhero characters in movies before, but this was one of the first big mass market 4-quadrant movies that showed that, hey, a superhero could rake in hundreds of millions of dollars at the box office and appeal to basically everyone. It was almost like our generation's version of Tim Burton's Batman, although you could argue that Tim Burton's Batman was our generation's version of Tim Burton's Batman. It really depends on how old you are. But Spider-Man 3 was pretty rough, and then when Andrew Garfield came back for the Amazing Spider-Man movies, Garfield was a fine Spider-Man, but those movies were bad. I mean, they didn't tell very satisfying self-contained stories. They were clearly the result of a studio trying to create their own cinematic universe, Marvel style, and failing horribly at doing so. The movies themselves feel heavily edited to shreds in a way that screams of studio tampering. They were just bad movies. And so Andrew Garfield got a pretty raw deal out of the whole situation. Sony currently owns the film rights to Spider-Man, and they need to continue making Spider-Man movies once every few years to retain those rights. And that's what a lot of these movies felt like. They felt like Sony's just out there making Spider-Man movies, not because they want to or because they have a clear idea or some imperative for this character to exist, but just because they want to hang on to those rights, baby, because this is a profit-making machine they got to milk. And the movies showed that. They showed that lack of heart and soul that Kevin Feige has brought to many Marvel films. So in my opinion, the main event of Spider-Man No Way Home is all of these three Spider-Men teaming up together, hanging out, talking with each other, sharing about their experiences. And it just is so cool to be able to see three different actors who play the same character be in the same movie as that character. It's so rare to be able to see something like that. It would be like if, you had Sean Connery and Roger Moore and Daniel Craig like hanging out each as James Bonds in a movie. Like, it just be mind-blowing. My brain's exploding the whole time I'm watching this movie. Beyond that, what is so touching about this movie is it's not just about the coolness of the Spider-Man hanging out. It's about the fact that being Spider-Man is hard, man. Being Spider-Man takes a toll. You see your loved ones die or get threatened all the time. You have to kill villains in order to stop them from doing more evil all the time. And these things take a psychological toll. And obviously, these are movies about men in tights shooting webs out of their arms and people in goblin suits flying on jetpacks and whatever. They're inherently kind of silly in some way, but to the extent that they can be serious, I think this movie tries to bring out more of the pathos that one might feel from these movies. And yeah, being Spider-Man is hard, and there's very few people who can understand how hard that is except other Spider-Men. And that's kind of one of the things that's beautiful about this film is like it acknowledges the pain that Peter Parker in this movie and Peter Parkers from previous films must have been going through. And it kind of submits that one way out of that pain, one way to heal from that pain, one way to understand that pain is by talking with others who have been through the same thing. And if you kind of really extrapolate out, like there's kind of this metaphor for what it's like to be in like grief counseling with others or support groups with others or something like that. Of course, the movie also has other problematic views on mental health and how it's curable sometimes using serums. But let's put that aside. It's about the pain of being Spider-Man and how there's camaraderie to be found with other Spider-Men. And that is really lovely. In addition, I just love all the other little geeky stuff, the little Easter eggs, the little stuff that they reward you for if you've been paying attention to the other Spider-Man movies. Like the fact that Tobey Maguire shoots webs out of his arms and the other Spider-Men have like the web cartridges. All that stuff, like they point that out, they laugh at it in the movie. And it's just stuff that like if you've been watching every single Spider-Man movie like I have since 2002 and you remember all these things and you read about them and you talked about them, and now like it's like somebody who made this movie, the people who made this movie wrote this movie, made it, put it together. They were also the same geeks about Spider-Man, and they also understood all those differences over time, and they kind of acknowledged it and laughed at it, and it's just really nice to be seen as like a geek, which is what I felt like while watching this movie. Anyway, can you tell I really enjoyed the movie? There were a few things I wasn't a huge fan of in the movie. I mean, one of the problems with this movie is that with this many characters, it does feel a little bit overstuffed. It's basically impossible for every single character here to get a satisfying arc. And so a lot of the arcs feel really abridged, and some of the characters barely get any screen time at all. And that's okay. I mean, the movie's really ambitious, is trying to bring all these characters together, and to the extent that some of them make any sort of impact, I feel like it's a success, but it does feel a little bit overstuffed. There's a lot of characters in here, and the movie does its best to manage that. I also feel like the action in these new Spider-Man movies, like this latest trilogy, has never been particularly great, in my opinion. I mean, it looks cool, but it always feels really CG heavy, and I never actually believe I'm watching like a human in a Spider-Man suit do all these things. It just feels like some character in a computer screen. And that's kind of a bummer, particularly towards the end of this movie. It's this big, huge CG battle fight scene, and it's hard to even tell what's happening some of the times. I still haven't seen a really satisfying like Spider-Man action-y ending yet in recent days, and I hope that we'll get one soon. But yeah, this movie, it did not deliver on that front. But where this movie did deliver is it manages to complete this Peter Parker's arc, the Tom Holland one, and it also manages to like go back in time, acknowledges some of the weaknesses of the previous films in both ways that are funny and sad and also serious. And try to make those films better, try to redeem those films in some way. You know, there are sequels, prequels, whatever, that retroactively make the films that came before better. You know, an example of that I would argue is like Rogue One. You could argue that like Rogue One, you watch Rogue One and like now you have a deeper understanding of Star Wars and New Hope, right? And this is a movie I feel like falls into that category. You watch this movie and now all the time and effort you put into like wanting the Amazing Spider-Man 2 to be good has kind of like paid off in some way. It kind of like retroactively justifies the 2+ hours I spent watching that movie. And that is a huge accomplishment, let me tell you. There's so many little lovely Spider-Man moments in this movie along those lines, like Andrew Garfield cracking Tobey Maguire's back, or Andrew Garfield saving MJ when a similar gambit failed in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. And at the end of the day, it just feels like this is a movie that's made for people that grew up on all the Spider-Man movies, that watched this character go through all these different iterations, for good or ill, that had their heart kicked around by these Spider-Man movies, and now they're like, hey, we're going to wrap it all up. We're going to bring this all to a conclusion. We're going to try to send these guys off in a really lovely, dignified, and beautiful way, and I think this movie really achieved it. The final thing I'll say is I love that they brought the two Spider-Men back, you know, Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield, and like seeing them interact with Tom Holland. Obviously, there's this idea of the Spider-Man characters talking with him, but on a meta level, there's also this idea of here are two guys who have kind of taken really different journeys through the Hollywood system, and it almost feels like they're kind of guiding this third one through the system as well. And all three of them have had very different journeys. And, you know, Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield are all successful in their own way. And Tom Holland, you know, his star is really rising. And I just couldn't help but read into it that it's like, hey, here are these two older guys kind of guiding this younger one along and saying like, it's hard out there. But, you know, there's other people out there who understand what you're going through. And that is a really beautiful idea as well, I think. So Spider-Man No Way Home, I laughed, I cried, I love this movie. I had so much fun. I'm also really curious to hear what you think. You should assume there's going to be spoilers in the comments, but let me know what you thought. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit like or subscribe, hit that bell icon to get notifications whenever I post a new video. Thank you to my patrons at patreon.com/Dave Chen for supporting my work. I really, really appreciate it. I hope you enjoy videos like this and all the other stuff I make over at patreon.com/Dave Chen. Until the next one, we'll see ya.